So today on the episode, we're going to talk about turning your real estate investment or your small portfolio into a business. Anyone who wants to do this long term, that should be the goal. I had read a quote and I thought it was kind of funny. It's like passive income sounds great until you realize you're on call 24/7, right? And that's kind of how it is when you start out. You're going to be working a job and have the portfolio on the side, or you're going to jump into it and just have a small portfolio. But if you're doing everything yourself, it's not really a business. It's kind of just a second job, right? So you have to try to figure out how you can get your real estate and turn it into a business where it's not relying on you, doing all the maintenance and lawn care and everything like that. And it's a true business where you have employees. When I started out, I remember I was always listening to Grant Cardone stuff. And he would always say, if you can't buy 32 units, you should just invest passively until you can. And I remember thinking like that, it's easy for him to say he's got billions or hundreds of millions of dollars and all this stuff. Like it's easy to say that, but people can't start out there, right? And then as I got into real estate and once we started buying bigger buildings, like once we bought our first 100-unit building, I was like, this does make sense. So like I can see why people say it. The economies of scale, it's a totally different thing when you're buying larger properties than it is when you're buying single family or small homes. And if you don't have the ambition to get to the larger properties, maybe you should just invest with other people or partner or something, because I think real estate needs to be done at scale. So we're going to do a couple episodes on that today. We're going to talk about, why you want to get to scale, some of the things you can do to track to get you there. And on the next episode, we'll talk about more systems and processes, things that we've used. The one thing I think is missed a lot when you start out buying real estate is you're always, if you're doing everything, if you're going there, and it's easy, if you have 4 units or 8 units and you're running there and doing the maintenance and doing the lawn care, that's not a hard thing. You're going to get a few calls and emergency calls, but you need to, right from the beginning, you should really track that amount of time, right? Because you might end up spending 100 or 300 hours a year on it, and you need to know, what's your hourly return on investment? Because if you're somebody who makes $40 an hour, and instead of going to that apartment on the weekend and mowing the lawn, you could just work overtime at your job and make $600 or $500 that day. Throughout the year, that's going to really add up. And if there's not a plan to scale, and that's just your long-term plan to do that, you might be better off, again, just working more at your job, not having the headaches, not taking the calls, and investing with someone else. If you like the idea of owning the property yourself and building that equity and actually scaling a company, that's kind of what we'll talk about in the next episode and stuff. So if that's your goal, if it's to turn, real estate into extra income for you and your family, you need to make sure that you're not just getting another job, right? If you're putting in all of those hours, if you make the majority of your money at your job and now you're working almost as much on the side doing the real estate, you have to make sure that it's actually, equaling that income, and you're making just as much from the hours you work on that property, whether that's an equity build or cash flow, as you would at your job, or else you're going to be better off just working more hours at your job. And again, putting it into something passive. There's a million ways to invest in real estate. There's publicly traded companies where your money, is liquid in and out. There's syndications, companies like ours. There's smaller companies than ours, bigger companies. You can invest money to, in flips, whatever you want to do, where you're not actually the one who has to do everything and do all of the work. Because the reality of real estate is it can be hard and it can go the wrong way too. The first 8-unit we ever bought, I remember when we signed the paperwork, the owner, they were an older couple. They'd had one property. It was 8 units and they'd held it for like 30 years. And they told me when we signed the paperwork, they're going to be like, they said, you're going to wish all the tenants quit breathing, right? Because that was their attitude. They had spent so many nights going there for calls and weekends and evenings and just putting in all these hours into this one building, which really, that building's never going to be worth 10 times what it was, right? So you put all this money and time and you're going to get a return. But if they really calculated how much time and effort and time away from their family and sleepless nights, it probably wasn't worth it as an investment. They could have done something else with the same investment they put in. So you have to determine that. And I think real estate as an investment is the best in the world as at risk adjusted. It's the best thing for sure in our country. But it's not necessarily the best way to make all the money, right? It's the best place to put it, to invest it. But to actually make it in real estate's hard, right? You have to, like when we started out, we owned an operating business. We owned a gym, and then we bought a trailer park, and we did that all on the side, evenings and weekends. And, we put in probably almost as much time into that park when we first opened it as we did in our main business. And it was kind of a joke because every time we went on a vacation, we'd land somewhere and I'd look at my voicemail and a water line broke or something froze up, or it was always like, something burnt down, or there was always that you had hanging over you, and you want to get out of that. You want to be able to, at the start, you're going to have to do everything, but you want to build to a point where you have managers and maintenance people, and it's a true business, right? You're doing your taxes differently, your financials, everything looks different. And the reality is at scale, things get a lot easier. More people want to loan money on bigger deals. It's a lot harder to finance the smaller ones. You get discounts on stuff. And even now, we'll look at our portfolio. We have some smaller buildings, 40 units and 30 units. And I look at it and think over 10 or 15 years, like, are we going to hold these buildings and spend the money? If you have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a roof on there versus a 100-unit property, it's a lot harder to get your money back out. So you need scale. You need it to be a business. So then there's always kind of the chicken or the egg thing. You could just jump in, raise capital, or maybe you have a bunch of capital and you could buy a big enough property where some of these things go away, some of these problems, and you can maybe hire someone. But you do have to understand, if it's your first investment, if you haven't invested with someone before and kind of watch what they're doing, if you're just jumping in, the problems are going to be that much bigger too, right? If you buy 100 units right off the hop, like big expenses can come, and you have to be able to cover that. Or if all of a sudden you do run up to 10% vacancy, that's 10 units that you have to fill, and you got to figure out how to market them and how to show them and how to turn them over. So you kind of have to decide, like, do you want to start smaller, learn everything, but have that plan to scale? And that's what I would probably recommend to people. I think starting too big, if you don't know what you're doing, that is where you can get in trouble. For sure, with leverage as high as you can get today, it's easy to get into a bigger property. You can get a $10 million property for $500,000 down. A lot of people could do that, but on a $10 million property, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong very quickly. So I'll just run through really quick the things, again, being small versus at scale and where you want to get. Like when you have just a few properties, you're doing everything yourself. One of the bigger things is you can't justify, or the building can't support having the software that you need to run everything, the staff, the systems, and you don't have economies at scale. Once you're bigger, again, a lot of the expenses are going to be the same on a big property versus a small. You're still going to have one roof or maybe one boiler. So it'll be slightly less, but as a percent of the building, it's a lot less on a big building. You'll get better deals. Contractors will give you better rates. Vacancy is a big one on the smaller stuff, right? A 4-unit, one person moves out, you're 25% vacant. CapEx is a lot harder to spend on those small buildings, and even tenant headaches. You have one bad tenant in a 4 or 8-unit building, that's a big headache, right? Once you get scale, then you can decide. You can hire a property manager, or if you're going to do this long term, build out your own. That you can afford to hire in-house staff. That's kind of where it makes sense. And some of the headaches will start to go away. Then you're just dealing with people. And the bigger thing is like you're able to support using the software that's built for managing properties, but you're going to need a few hundred units to do that. But you have accounting and screening, automation. There's all those things that you can have when you have scale. And then your cost is spread across units, right? When you have, like now with the new properties we're buying, we'll be at about 500 units. If we buy a new property and all of a sudden vacancy runs up or something happens, we have hundreds of other units that are still cash flowing and are stabilized. So it spreads it out a lot more. It's a lot easier than when you're small with just a few properties. And I guess ideally, with the passive income, you want the business to be at a level where it's not relying on you every day. Right. So what we'll get into in the next episode is more of those systems and processes. Years ago, I took a scaling course on scaling a business, and they use numbers which don't directly tie to real estate. But the first one was $1 million. It's like, to get $1 million business, it's not that hard. You just have to, have something and you're kind of proving out what you're doing to get to $1 million in sales. But then to get to 3 to 5, that's where the systems and process come in place, right? And most businesses without implementing that stuff will never get past that level. And I've seen it with tons of businesses. They'll get up and maybe they're on a growth trajectory and they're like, we're going to grow so fast. And they get up to that level and then they'll fall back down because they don't have the systems and the processes in place. They can't repeat the same thing. And then the next level, I don't know, 7 to 10 million, but it was, you need the right people. You need the people that can use those systems. And that's where you're replacing yourself, right? Everything that I do, I should be able to hire someone to come in and do that. So in the next couple episodes, we're going to talk about getting you past that initial phase. Today, we kind of explained, I think, why you want to, why it's not going to be passive income if you just buy 1 or 2 properties. And I also don't think it's ever going to be worth the headache and the risk versus just investing in real estate with someone else if you don't have a plan to scale. So from today, know your starting out, even if you just have that 1 or 2 properties, know your hourly return on investment. What does that look like versus if you just worked at your job? How much more money could you make? And and be honest with yourself, like, is this worth it? Like, I know there's an ego component to it. You see this even with people that invest with us or want to, but are you better off if you're just going to buy 1 8-unit your entire life, owning that, saying that's your building versus investing in bigger portfolios and the phone calls and taking time away from your family? And I go back to those people that I bought that first building from. I'm sure if they had rather just bought into a REIT or something like that and played it out for the 30 years, they'd be at the same spot or better off because they were in higher class properties and they wouldn't have had all the headache and the hate towards the tenants and the weekends and the evening. So be honest with yourself. If you want to grow it into a business, so that's kind of what we're talking about in the next couple episodes. So thanks for listening this week, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.